and then I start. Okay.
Yeah, just to introduce you, the bare minimum, because we want to hear you.
Okay, excellent.
Hi, and welcome to Delicious Desires, Queer Foodways in South Asia, a first of its kind conference to link scholarship around India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh on matters of food and queerness. We have a spectacular and scrumptious offering today and tomorrow, and we can't wait to share it with all of you. And now I will hand it over to Professor Madhavi Menon, who will introduce the panel, the keynote panel. Professor Menon is the director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality and professor of English at Ashoka University. Welcome, all of you.
Thank you, Neil. Welcome to everybody. Good evening, good morning, depending on which part of the globe you're in. Our keynote speaker for today, for instance, is very early in the morning, and we are later in the evening here in Delhi. It is my absolute delight to introduce our keynote speaker for a wonderful conference on delicious desires, because of course, if we are what we eat, I really want to know what queer people eat, and sort of, maybe bring out a cookbook by the end of this conference today and tomorrow. And our keynote speaker is the wonderful and fabulous Parama Roy, who is professor of English at University of California at Davis, and the author of many really important books. Most pertinent for us today is Alimentary Tracts, Appetites, Aversions, and the Post-Colonial. And her talk today, whether drawn from that or not, I don't know. I think it's a more recent offering, a more recent appetizer, is wonderfully titled On Wolfish Appetites, Tales of Taste and Kinship. Parama will speak for about half an hour, and we'll devote the remaining 25 minutes or so to Q&A from the audience. So please post your questions at any time during the session, both while she's speaking and after that, under the Q&A sign, and Neil will sort of sift through them and pose your questions to Parama after she's done speaking. So thanks very much, and Parama, all yours. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Wolfish Appetites.
Thank you, Madhavi. Good evening to everyone here. My warm thanks to the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University, to Madhavi and to Neil for conceiving of this project, appropriately described as fabulous, and appropriately named Delicious Desires. Thanks to all of you for attending, even though I can't see most of you. At the University of California, Davis, which is where I teach, some of the most distinguished applications to the PhD program that we receive are from graduate students at Ashoka. So it is good to know that some of you are here, even if virtually. So I'm going to start a screen share. Sorry, okay. All right. So in Eating Well, Derrida invites us to reimagine the mouth in place of the face as the locus of an ethical encounter with the other, and to think of eating as the act through which we consume and are consumed in turn. And indeed, the most rudimentary analysis of gastronomical grammars elucidates the ways in which eating, or more broadly, the whole activity of the alimentary tract itself, both stages and queers the distinction between self and other, precisely because by eating and digesting, whether alone or in company, we take into our own bodies the bodies as well as the baggage of others. Who eats what and with whom, who starves, and what is rejected as food, these arrangements and occasions are among the elemental ways we are bound to others, including and perhaps especially those that we hold at a distance. The alimentary tract is, as we know, a boundary, a fiercely policed but also a contested and hotly trafficked one, in the way we are used to thinking of racial or color lines as boundaries elsewhere. Caste, religion, race, gender, sexuality, all these travel through the mouth and the digestive tract and are formed through this itinerary. Eating and digestion are irreducibly performative acts. We need hardly be reminded of this in South Asia with our own highly wrought and often violently exclusive lexicons of permitted and abominated caste and religious intimacies. And yet, as we keep learning, such forms of regulated eating and regulated aversion are not always neatly isomorphic with the messy terrain of identification, desire, and disgust. As Keela Tompkins has demonstrated gorgeously about the sadistic racialized eating of 19th century America, indigestion rather than incorporation often can result for practitioners of racialized voracity. Our sense of who eats and who is eaten and what this eating might involve, whether it involves engrossment or transformation or indigestion, is profoundly deranged. And while food can be a boundary, it can equally be a portal, an opening into determinedly or unexpectedly dissident forms. How then, given these inherited contexts and pedagogies, and the urgency to imagine otherwise, might we imagine the alimentary tract that constitutes queer eating or queer taste or queer modes of conviviality? Can we assume its legibility or its distinction from normative forms of desire, reproduction, embodiment, kin-making, and sociality? I'm particularly keen to see how my fellow panelists, as well as members of this audience, respond to the provocation of this conference. But for myself, I want to remain mindful of the etymology of the word queer, which, as the OED reminds us, derives from the German queer. And, please forgive my German, which I do not have at all. So pardon me for butchering the language. Anyway, so the word queer, which translates, the OED tells us, as transverse, oblique, crosswise, at right angles, obstructive, obstructive of things going wrong, peculiar, directed sideways. Perhaps this is a salutary reminder to us of the degree to which queerness eludes our definitions or refuses to be domesticated into entirely legible or coherently liberatory forms. I say this as I present a narrative whose relationship to queer taste and queer eating is by no means straightforward. So, to begin then again. When Rudyard Kipling published the Jungle Books in the mid-1890s, he bestowed enduring fame upon the figure of the wolf child through his protagonist Mowgli. As we might perhaps know, he was not the only begetter of stories about wolf children. Since the mid-19th century, stories about real-life Mowglis in the Indian subcontinent had captured the imagination of Anglo-Indians as well as of scholarly and popular audiences in the Anglophone world, and Kipling certainly was familiar with them. The powerful appeal for readers of Mowgli, the first of his creator's many composite creations with a foot in many worlds, is that he can gather around him a fraternity of like-minded comrades across species lines. It's what one critic has called a trans-species brotherhood that multiplies his capacity to move between worlds. Far from being at a disadvantage as a result of being brought up among animals, he is a proficient scholar of jungle values and skills, as well as of human language and mores. In practically every respect, Mowgli's prodigious gifts and his skills at negotiating his trans-species habitat and upbringing are antithetical to what was proclaimed about the real-life wolf boys, all of whom were distinguished by a host of so-called animal deficiencies rather than human capacities. Yet the career of the non-fictional wolf children of Imperial South Asia offers a different and at least as compelling a vision of kinship across species and race as any imagined by Kipling. Now, as we know, stories of animal-raised children are not new. Romulus and Remus, anyone? Anyway, but in 19th century India, what had begun in the European context as a mythological or folkloristic genre changed form, coming to be newly seen as an anthropological category. So-called wolf children made an appearance in Awadh, primarily as a result of the efforts of General William Henry Sleeman, then resident at the court of Awadh. He codified stories about wolf children and brought the wolf child into being as a legible anthropological category, identifying a cluster of 6 to 7 wolf boys, all from this region. In Sleeman's telling, Indian parents in villages frequently had their children abducted and eaten by wolves. But they were so convinced that killing wolves would draw destruction upon them that they were prepared effectively to sacrifice their children in order to avert such calamity. But notwithstanding this situation of widespread lupine predation, an occasional wolfish mother became a foster parent to human children rather than their devourer, nurturing them for several years and fighting to the death to prevent their being taken away from her by humans. A second important cluster of wolf boys came to end up in the orphanage for Indian children run by the Church Missionary Society in Sikandra in the 1870s and 1880s. Photographs of the best known and most long-lived of these boys, Dina Sanichar, were on sale at the orphanage, as was an account of his capture and life at the institution. He was said to have provided the germ for the character of Mowgli. But the best known and the most extensively documented wolf children were the girls Amla and Kamala of Medinipur. They were allegedly rescued from wolves by the Reverend Joseph Amritulal Shingo of Medinipur, a Bengali missionary who housed them in his orphanage and endeavored, along with his wife, to inculcate human norms in them. In the 1930s, after the girl's death, he produced a diary of these efforts as well as a number of photographs of the children engaged in various activities. This drew widespread interest in Britain and the United States, with scholars divided about whether the story was authentic or a gigantic hoax. Now, wolf children, as products of lupine rather than human culture, had certain features in common, we are told. Their locomotion was quadrupedal, and it was only with difficulty and in response to force that they adopted bipedalism. And you can see evidence of that in some of these photographs by the Singhs. They preferred raw meat to cooked food of any kind, and usually they shunned clothing. They did not exercise control over excretory functions, and an offensive odor often clung to their bodies. They had no capacity for human speech, but made animal sounds. They fled the company of humans, adult and juvenile, but often existed on terms of intimacy with non-human animals with whom they ate and played, and by whom they were treated with great friendliness. Endeavors to make them conform to normatively human behaviors and identifications invariably miscarried. And typically, though not invariably, they lived foreshortened lives among humans after being rescued, dying in their teens. Now, as the foregoing accounts will attest, the wolf child gained a certain fame as an appendage to or inhabitant of the Anglican missionary orphanage. Indeed, of all the constituencies who gave credence to the wolf child phenomenon, The most notable were evangelical Anglican missionaries who worked hard to publicize their status as wolf children. Why, we may ask, did the missionaries at Sikandra unquestioningly accept a stream of alleged wolf children? And why specifically did they attest to the wolf child status of these children, rather than describing them simply as orphans, or in terms of an available diagnostic lexicon, whether in Hindustani or in English, of pagalpan or imbecility? Instead, the children brought to the doorstep of the orphanage, but rejected by all other humans, including their parents, were to be accorded an unquestioning welcome as wolf children. This was because for the authorities at the orphanage, these otherwise freakish children would come over the years to be seen as actors in a conspicuous religious drama, one that assumed the lineaments of a miracle narrative. The wolf child's preservation as a human child in the midst of predators was seen as a variant upon and a confirmation of biblical miracles, such as the preservation of Daniel in the lion's den. If anything, the question of scientific or anthropological credibility was held in abeyance so as to accord narratological preeminence to the sheer strangeness of the child's survival among the ferocious animals for whom he should have functioned as food. Anthropological explanation, in other words, was jettisoned in favor of a theological one, creating the narrative infrastructure for reading his survival as the effect of divine intent, contrary to the known laws of nature rather than in accord with them, hence its status as miracle. In this arrangement, the wolf child is translated from the status of human detritus to that of a soul saved by evangelical love. And the natural world itself is charged by an overflowing magnanimity rather than being read in tooth and claw. This surpasses both the arrangements of local superstition, in which the child remains unassimilable within caste society and familial space, and it also surpasses the diagnostic paradigms of science, in which Shanichar is no more than an imbecile. This expansive view of the wolf child's reality provides narrative closure and a collateral moral theological authority simply unavailable to local non-Christian modes of thought, or even to a medical scientific lexicon that devalues human difference. The miracle narrative of Shanichar, on the other hand, can turn the experience of aberration and disposability into a story of unexpected grace. The wolf child phenomenon produces several nodes of heterodox kinship involving doting wolves, disposable or sacrificable Indian children, and quasi-paternal missionaries. It is based not on heterosexual reproduction or blood ties or familial arrangements, but on improbable obligations and intimacies and the practice of sacrificial love. In key ways, the phenomenon is also a narrative about the reconstitution of appetites, often in strikingly counterintuitive and non-naturalistic ways. A critical role is played in these stories by the mother wolf, who undertakes the aberrant task of rearing human children in a remarkable reversal of roles from predator to protector. In doing this, she operates within a logic of self-sacrifice for practically every tale of the encounter between astonished humans and the wolf mother, who is claiming or protecting her human young, ends in a violent death for the wolf mother, as she fights to the death to save her foster child from capture by humans. Her compact with the human child, initiated with the gift of her milk, reaches its apogee with the shedding of her blood on the child's behalf. Several writers try to account for the wolf mother's anomalous adoption and feeding of human infants and children. Two two scenarios were generally conjured up to account for her unwanted renunciation of the toothsome flesh of the human infant. One was that the animal began by seizing the human infant as prospective prey, but spared it when she returned to her lair to find other sources of food already provided by her lupine companions. Having been spared its intended fate as food for wolfish mouths, the human infant picked up the smell of the other cubs in the lair and began to be numbered among them. That's story number one. A second scenario, imagine the wolf mother as mourning the loss of her cubs. Whether these were lost to hunters or other forms of violence is unclear. And so in mourning the loss of her cubs, she seeks to find a substitute whom she might nurture in their stead. Especially in the second incarnation, as a bereaved mother seeking a surrogate, the wolf mother was exalted as preternatural in her gentleness and overflowing love. The description of this wolf mother by Arnold Gesell, the distinguished director of the Clinic of Child Development at Yale and the author of a fictionalized biography of the wolf child Kamla, gives the flavor of such imaginings. Now, I'm not going to read the whole passage in the interest of time, but I will do something of a reading of this passage. So the sheer force of mother's milk, produced through hormonal action and seeking to express itself through engorged teats, might seem to reduce the wolf mother to a mere instrument of inexorable biological functions. Yet, these very biological functions transform the wolf mother in a way that they do not transform the human mother who abandons her own infant or extinguishes its life. Lactation endows the wolf mother with attributes or virtues that alter her biological nature insofar as it is wolfish. Her eyes become preternaturally mild. The jaws, normally instruments of predation, function as a makeshift forceps in a sublime obstetrics that compensates for the lack of human arms to cradle a human infant. No mention is made at any point of a wolf father, even though a male-female mated pair constitutes the core of the wolf pack in the natural world. In several accounts, an iconography of the wolf mother emerges that is curiously reminiscent of classical Roman as well as Roman Catholic models of charity, both of which instantiate with great literalism the milk of human kindness in the form of altruistic lactation. So, for many centuries, the female human breast has been represented in literary, mythological, and art historical sources as a source of fertility and nourishment, both physical and spiritual. One striking and significant variant of this iconography in the Western world features lactation scenes where the woman does not suckle an infant, but rather an adult male. Its source derives from the story told by the first century Roman historian Valerius Maximus of a woman who secretly breastfed her father after he had been incarcerated and sentenced to death by starvation. This came to be known as caritas romana, an exemplary act of pietas, or filial piety, and it was popular in ancient Roman art. There are also numerous depictions of caritas romana in Baroque and Renaissance art. In Christian art, representations of infant nursing in the form of the Virgin Mary suckling the Christ child came to function as figures of charity, the greatest of the three theological virtues. Medieval shrines in possession of vials in which Mary's milk was preserved attracted large throngs of pilgrims from all over the Christian world. But Christian art also represented the Virgin giving her milk to recipients other than the Christ child himself, including full-grown males. in portrayals of the vision of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. The Cistercian monk turns to Mary, asking her to prove that she is indeed the Mother of God, and she responds with a stream of milk from her breast. This was a relatively popular theme among medieval and early modern painters. For Bernard, as Carolyn Walker Bynum observes, the maternal image is almost without exception elaborated as not as giving birth or sheltering in a womb, but as nurturing, particularly suckling. So breastfeeding is the sphere in which the putative givens of female biology can become the ground of female virtue. The iconography of altruistic breastfeeding from breasts that are always full for the taking generally features human and intra-species suckling. But in the wolf children's stories, it is the wolf mother who comes to embody the overflowing breast. Her charity being the more remarkable for being directed to a surrogate born not of her own body or even of her own species. On the one hand, milk is the one bodily fluid that is supposedly designed to function as a gift without return, sustaining the life of another. The Siksu of the newly born woman affirms this maternal gift or feminine economy as a rebuke to modern assumptions of possessive individualism and conditions of scarcity. But with the invention of the heterosexual nuclear family and of bourgeois family relations, this maternal milk is often also presumed to circulate within relatively constrained circuits of intimacy or sociality, circuits that are usually governed by an idea of natural limits. What happens then when the movement of this quasi-occult fluid crosses the species barrier? And what ideas of kinship and of charity come to be rethought when the cornucopia of the lupine breast goes to sustain those outside its presumably natural orbits and boundaries? The wolf mother's breastfeeding is both the fulfillment of nature while also in excess of it, in being extended as an overflow to vulnerable human recipients. Those who explained in naturalistic terms how a wolf mother could come to adopt a human infant or child had some trouble explaining the duration of her nurture of her foundlings. Given the extended duration of human infancy, those adopted by wolves would have needed to be fed and protected for several years, long after wolf cubs had become self-sufficient. Most of these human adoptees were slower at getting around on their hands and knees than their wolf compatriots, and they manifested no special skills in hunting at all. And so they were, in general, unproductive, backward, and relatively sluggish members of the wolf pack. And so they had to have constituted a significant burden on their adoptive community, in addition to jeopardizing the safety. The nurture of human children then was an extravagance. It was an eccentricity, flying in the face of anything that one might define as lupine self-interest or self-protectiveness. Yet the wolf mothers continued their nurture and protection of these superfluous beings, even and especially to the point of laying down their lives for them. Might we be justified in seeing in the representation of the prodigiously generous and self-sacrificing wolf mother something like an imitatio Mariae, or at least the exploits of a lupine saint? Her exudations, first of breast milk and then of blood, and her embrace of a chosen kinship to the point of martyrdom are nothing less than holy or miraculous. More specifically, in her labors of nurture in defiance of the normative conditions in the natural world, including the participation of a male parent, and in her painful separation from a beloved child, the wolf mother seems to conform to a logic of Marian love and loss. There is, it must be noted, an obvious paradox in this exaltation of the wolf mother, especially on the part of the missionaries with whom the wolf children came to reside. Their writings celebrate the caregiving of the lupine mother and the heroic forfeit of her own life, even as they also see their own practice of rescuing and civilizing wolf children as a heaven-sent opportunity and as evidence that their work proceeds under divine sanction. Their own works of charity are predicated upon the violent displacement of the animal parent, who has given everything, including her milk and her life, for her alien offspring. For the missionary men to become human fathers to the fatherless wolf children, there has then to be an agonizing but nonetheless obligatory sacrifice of the maternal lupine. In her death, the wolf mother comes to fulfill her destiny, completing her transition from Marian fount of milk and love to martyr. And maternal hospitality, having accomplished its function, must yield to a paternal, visibly Christian form. Notwithstanding her critical role in saving the children in the first place, and the sublimity of her love and self-sacrifice, the rightful terminus of the wolf children's progress is not the wolf's den, but the Christian harbor of the orphanage. In the case of the wolf girls, Amala and Kamala, the Reverend Singh can assume through the wolf mother's death a new and consecrated role, which is that of father to the wolf girls. And the diary of the 9 years that he lavished on the care of the girls is a catalogue of this patient, unstinting parental love that his wife and he directed towards children who seemed often to be very unpromising subjects indeed. Within the protocols of the modern-day miracle unfolding on imperial terrain, missionary fathers and lupine mothers are enabled to become transspecies partners of a singular kind. Their common labors of love, undertaken sequentially rather than simultaneously, work to create new networks of hospitality and kinship for worthless, vulnerable children cast out of their natal human families. But only the missionary fathers can survive to recount the tale of miraculous survival. Wolf Mother's actions, unmatched though they are in their awe-inspiring quality, constitute the prelude to the text of evangelical hospitality and conversion. Now, if the missionaries accord an awed admiration to the Wolf Mother's renunciation of human flesh and to her positive gifts to her adoptees of milk and blood, there is much more ambiguity in the stories about the feral children's own appetites, which constitute one of the most distinctive marks of their ferality. The children, we are told, had ravenous appetites. They repeatedly reject cooked food for raw flesh. Their relationship to food is driven by highly developed powers of olfaction that are characteristic of animals rather than humans. In instance after instance, we are told of their specifically wolfish appetites, including for the most rebarbatively unyielding parts of animal bodies, such as bones, which would require very strong teeth and jaws to masticate. So Sleeman, for instance, notes of one of the original wolf boys of Awadh, and this is a quote, "He is very fond of bones, particularly uncooked ones, which he masticates apparently with as much ease as meat. He has eaten half a lamb at a time without any apparent effort, and is very fond of taking up earth and small stones and eating them," unquote. The beastly mouth reveals itself as such by a taste for forbidden and unappetizing foods or non-foods, such as raw meat, blood, carrion, stones, etc., and unappetizing modes of ingestion. Singh tells us that the unreformed Kamala had a great appetite for meat, stealing it routinely and eating it ferociously. On one occasion, she seized upon the discarded entrails of a fowl and consumed them avidly. And that's supposedly the photograph on the left side of your screen. On another occasion, feathers and remnants of meat on her lips and cheek indicated that she had devoured the carcass of a chicken. She gravitated to carcasses of dead animals and birds, even competing with vultures and crows on one occasion. Unlike their lupine mothers, these wolf children demonstrate no gift for alimentary renunciation. Their most noteworthy bodily property is an all-devouring mouth. And, here I want to speak about, just note very briefly the distinction that several people have made. And I'm here relying on Sarah Guyer's summary of this, where she distinguishes, following in the lead of Jean-Luc Nancy and Derrida, she distinguishes between two words for mouth. One is in Latin, one is os, which is the mouth that speaks, and the other is bucca, which is the more primitive mouth, and it is also the non-speaking mouth. So in the case of Amala and Kamala, Singh maintains, the very mouth, teeth, jaws, and nostrils had undergone modification during the long period of lupine nurture, approximating those of a wolf rather than a human. Like other wolf children, they eat, we are told, like dogs, lowering their mouths to their plates for solid foods and lapping up liquids. They use jaws and teeth and tongue exclusively, rather than the hands and utensils that mark human alimentation. Since the work of the hand is tied to the work of the mouth, that is to say, the os, through the instrumentalities of speech and of mediated human eating, one can think of humanity as constituted by a hand-mouth nexus. The hand may even be said to be a technology that serves to uphold human bipedalism, mediating between the human mouth and food. And in doing this, it keeps the former from being defined entirely by the downward gravitational pull of physical appetites, and helps retain its status as os, that is the speaking mouth, rather than bucca, that is the devouring mouth or the non-speaking mouth. Bypassing the mediation of the hand in eating, combined with a preference for non-human messmates, is among the surest signs of the children's animal status. Given too their predilection for urinating and defecating without let or restraint, one can speak of them as no more than alimentary canals open on both ends. Unsurprisingly, a key aspect of their orality, in addition to the ravening mouth and the incontinent nether regions, is a deficiency in human speech and a taste for snarling and growling. Therefore, a significant dimension of their humanization at the hands of missionaries involves the pedagogy of human gustation and human modes of eating. The children struggle, says Singh, between the habits developed among wolves and the novelties and challenges of their unfamiliar human environment. The development of a sense of taste for human foods was among their first responses to their relocation from a jungle to a human habitat. Since the children's only pleasure appeared to derive from the satisfaction of appetite, the Singhs focused on the retraining of appetite in their endeavor to render the children human. They developed an elaborate alimentary pedagogy using biscuits and sweets, using a complicated set of maneuvers, not only to inculcate in the children a taste for the foods of civilization, but also to induce the practice of bipedalism and the use of human language. Using biscuits as the royal road to humanization yields some results, albeit haltingly. Eventually, Kamala learned to reach with her hands for the treats, we are told. She acquired a taste for salt. She came to ignore uncooked meat and a dead fowl strategically left out to tempt her. She insisted upon using her own plate and glass, and she avoided the company of dogs rather than sharing their meals. The most striking moment in her elementary education was the learning of abstinence. It was a learning not to eat, in other words. So she learned self-sacrifice when she surrendered her own biscuit rather than claiming more biscuits than the other children were given. So this is a learning to taste rather than a learning to than a devouring. And this is a signal of a passage from animality to humanity. What might we make of these multi-species dramas of the alimentary tract? On the one hand, an embattled evangelicalism on the imperial frontier takes on unanticipated animal partners as well as severely deprived human ones. And it does this to conjure up a miraculous vision of solidarities, intimacies, and familial forms founded in the sacrifice of species-specific appetite, that's in the case of the wolf, and the cultivation of novel trans-species tastes and practices of commensality. Might one call this, to use the terms of the conference, an eating from a different queer menu? Is it a recipe for queerness in its very departures from caste-bound permissions and prohibitions, its embrace of dietary pollution, and its turn to forms of non-normative reproduction? Perhaps. But before we become too overcome by this momentary vision of a queer peaceable kingdom, we want also to note that this multi-species ecology is also inseparable from an assertion of civilizational, that is to say, racial religious supremacism. As is so frequently the case where matters of animality, empire, and racialized humans are concerned from the mid-19th century onwards, certain forms of inclusion, in this case that of the wolf child and that of the wolf mother within the fold of the evangelical, familial norms, these forms of inclusion are made possible by certain displacements and exclusions, in this case, that of the careless, superstitious, insufficiently loving Indian parents. We might note also that the wolf mother herself must invariably be sacrificed for evangelical hospitality to come into its own. And the wolf children themselves must be domesticated into the abdication of wolfish appetites and their taste for animal company at the table. Their animalization makes them the object of divine protection and evangelical love to begin with, but the animal forms of eating and conviviality are also what need most urgently to be policed and renounced. There is then no easy or singular answer as to the queerness or normativeness of these conjugations of evangelical missionary men, unprotected children, and maternal wolves animated by divine inspiration. So for the moment, I want to leave open the question of the queerness of these desires and arrangements, whether of kinship or of appetite. I will note only that in braiding together animal, human, and divine realms, the wolf child story showcases certain challenging questions about appetite, renunciation, and commensality, and about the ways in which subjects, objects, communities, and worlds are made through the alimentary tract. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Parama. And you're going to stop screen share, or?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that wonderfully rich and just sort of so intricate and interesting talk. And I know we have a lot of questions and very little time, so I'll just sort of quickly make an observation and ask you a short question, and then we can move on. My observation being that, if we're thinking about this in the tradition of Mary and piety and all the pietas that you were talking about, what's interesting is that the mother here is celebrated and the child is seen as animal-like, as opposed to the Christian tradition in which Catholicism notwithstanding, Jesus is, the head honcho, the top boss, and the mother sort of devalued. But that was just an observation. My question was a bit more sort of practical, contextual, which is what you talk about as elementary renunciation of the mother, the wolf mother, giving the milk, and all that sort of sentimentalization around mother's milk that you so wonderfully pointed out to us. What about cultures, societies, periods in which mother's milk was considered to be unhealthy for the child, or not something that signified care, but actually signified danger?
Yeah. Okay, let me try to respond severally to the points that you have raised. I mean, your first point, about the ways in which the wolf child story, or the sort of the exaltation of the wolf mother as a kind of animal form of Mary, if you will, or at the very least as a certain kind of lupine saint, it both uses, but also in extraordinary ways departs, right, from a certain kind of norm that we know, right? And so the children here in this scenario have a most extraordinary space. I mean, the children are, of course, central, to this kind of economy, right? And so there is no miracle, as it were, right, without this sort of damaged child in the center of it, right? And in a sense, it is precisely the fact of his being supposedly damaged in some way, of being vulnerable in some way, that makes him also the most worthy object, if you will, of love, of charity, right? And so, I mean, a very different kind of affect is directed towards him than is directed towards the Christ child. And so, yes, there is a certain, as you say, a certain kind of curious mixing and matching of different kinds of elements, right, borrowed from the Roman tradition, from the Roman Catholic tradition, and so on, and sort of set to work in a different kind of context. Yeah. The second question that you were asking about contexts where mother's milk is dangerous, could you say a little more about that? Are you thinking of breastfeeding as dangerous for the mother's health, which of course is a commonplace notion in many parts of the world, and
not healthy for the child? And the sort of breast milk not being healthy for the child.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, many competing discourses, right? I mean, about breastfeeding, about the energizing properties, the health-giving properties, even the divine properties of mother's milk, right? I mean, all of them sort of coexisting with one another, abutting one another, and so on. And, this is happening, of course, in this begins the story of the wolf child, and the story of lupine nursing, of course, begins in the 19th century, where the practice also of wet nursing, right, is so common, right? Yeah. It is common among, Anglo-Indians, in the subcontinent. It's also fairly common in Britain among, bourgeois women, as it were, right? And so there are these competing economies that live side by side, right? And so on the one hand, the sense that, the child needs to be fed elsewhere, that this is not good for the mother's health, perhaps may not be good for the child's health, and so on. But, it coexists with this other sort of strain of Marian devotion, where Mary is revered, right, precisely because she suckles the Christ child, who is not just her child, but, he is the savior of humankind, as it were, right? And so it is also a gift of charity to the whole world. So I would, only say about this that these exist in a certain kind of relationship of adjacency to one another, as it were, not necessarily canceling one another out, right, but existing in, simultaneously, if you will.
Great, thank you. I know Neil is sort of curating questions and will come in now with them. We have about 5 minutes left before our next session. So Neil, all yours.
Thank you, Parama, for that wonderful presentation and that lovely set of images that you showed us today. The first question is, and I think this was what we began with also, are we what we eat? And how would you interpret that and why?
Yeah, well, you know, if I can answer it with very specific reference to the wolf child story. I mean, clearly the notion that we are what we eat, right, is literalized in a sense in the story of the wolf child, right? And so, you know, part of the the wolf child's nurture, you know, I mean, it's what saves the wolf child, which is, you know, wolfish milk, but it is also what turns him, as it were, into this sort of half human, half wolf creature, as it were, right? And these notions, especially of maternal milk, right, as crucial in the making of identities, in the constitution, not just of bodies, right, but, you know, of psyches as well, right? So both soma and psyche, as it were, right, derive from this notion of the breast at which you feed, right? I mean, that in a sense provides a certain kind of script for where you will end up, right? Which is why there is so much anxiety around, you know, whose breast it is at which you are feeding, right? I mean, you see this, you know, through the 19th century, you see this also in the early 20th century. I don't know if that quite answers your question, you know. You know, I've perhaps been too specific. You know, when we say that, you know, we are what we eat, you know, this involves, of course, different kinds of things. You know, when we eat, you know, we ingest a certain kind of other, but we are also remade by that kind of ingestion, as it were, right? And so eating is always, you know, also a transformation, and a transformation in ways that we don't necessarily expect. I mean, Bell Hooks has this sort of famous line about, I mean, she has a famous essay about eating the other, which I think is interesting, but I think we might want to think about this kind of eating the other as not just a one-way traffic, if you will. That we come to be deranged from ourselves, we come to be estranged from ourselves, right? Even as we eat.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have just time for one last question very quickly. I think in many of the images, the body in the image, from the many images that you showed, is as a bare body. So to what extent do you think food is related to the body, and which is not necessarily gastrointestinal?
Yeah, I mean, with these images, I mean, there are several things that form a cluster, right? And it's impossible to separate out one ingredient from another, right? So certain kinds of feral eating practices, right, are inseparable from other forms of rejection of humanness, as it were, right? So if the biblical human is somebody who, you know, demonstrates restraint, you know, accepts limits on appetite, and also acknowledges shame, right? I mean, these form a certain kind of cluster, right? And I mean, it goes all the way back, you know, not to be terribly facile about it, but to the Garden of Eden, right? Which is both about a training of appetite, but also a certain kind of learning of shame, right? And so they are conjoined. It is impossible to think one outside of the other. Right? And what we find in the description of, you know, the Singh's experiments with the children is that these several experiments in civilizing, you know, are occurring concurrently. So teaching them to eat like humans, teaching them the rudiments of shame, and therefore the necessity of clothing, teaching them how to be bipedal, teaching them language, all of that.
I think that concludes this panel, the keynote panel. Thank you so much, Professor Roy, for joining us today and presenting a wonderfully rich history, a rich literary narrative. Thank you so much, Professor Roy.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you, Madhavi.
Thanks very much. And we're going to be moving straight into our second session in a few minutes. Neil will introduce that to us. So I hope those of you in the audience will be able to stay on for yet another enriching hour with delicious desires. Thank you so much, Parama. That was a wonderful beginning.
Thank you.
Right, we go on to queering spaces, queering times, queer foodways in contemporary cultures. And this panel will be moderated by Shuchi. Over to you now, Shuchi.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Thank you everyone for joining us today in today's session. And I have with us our first panelist in the series of panel discussion that will span today and tomorrow. I have with me Shuchi Karim, who is a feminist academic and researcher from Bangladesh and is currently a visiting professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University in Canada. Her areas of research include transnational feminism, intersectionality, gender and development issues, amongst others. Our second panelist is Yamuna Sangarasivam, who is the professor of anthropology and director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. She has worked extensively on nationalism, intersectionalities of race, class, gendered identities, food and culture, and decolonizing pedagogies, amongst many other themes. Thank you both for joining us today in the discussion. Before we begin, I would like to brief the format of our discussion. Each speaker will present for 15 minutes, after which we will have 10 minutes of moderated conversation, followed by the Q&A with the audience. The audience can use the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen at any point of the discussion to pose questions to our panelists. And I would like to now invite Professor Yamuna to begin her presentation. You're on mute, Professor Yamuna. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful introduction. And thank you also for this opportunity to join you in this wonderful conference. So let me begin. Food nourishes not only our bodies, but also our sense of sovereignty, solidarity, and justice. Emergent queer communities are renewing culinary experiences curated by historically marginalized community members whose intersectional, fluid, gendered identities challenged dominant structures of social relations and power. Realizing the potential to advance food sovereignty and justice, artists are creating radical aesthetics and spaces to honor and empower non-white queer communities through culinary experiences that decenter heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist colonial constructs of identity and sovereignty. Queer cultures carry a political valence that allows people to divest from the colonizing binary norms of domination by making conscious choices to create wellness collectives, rituals, aesthetics, and resurgent commitments to sovereignty and justice. So to queer as a verb, to resist, to disrupt, to disturb racist, sexist, patriarchal, white supremacist, heteronormative, colonial, capitalist structures, to create, make visible, voice, liberatory, resurgence, to acknowledge epistemologies and ontologies beyond the heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist, binaries, and hierarchical orderings of human and non-human beings. Drawing on Vivian May's conceptualization of intersectionality, we can understand queer and queerings as an epistemological practice, an ontological project, a radical coalitional political orientation, and a resistant imaginary. Speculative ethnography is a practice of resistant imaginary. It is a methodology that invites us into a way of knowing and a way of being in radical, coalitional, politically engaged practices of scholarship and solidarity with multiple identities and communities. Speculative ethnography is a willful methodology. So Sarah Ahmed, in her work, Willful Subjects, defines willfulness as this. Willfulness is the word used to describe the perverse potential of will and to contain that perversity in a figure. Our tendency to associate willfulness with human flaws and sin would become a synonym not only for the desire to punish the perverts, but to restrict perversion to the conduct of a few. If willfulness provides a container for perversion, my aim, says Sarah Ahmed, is to spill this container, end quote. Speculative ethnography is a methodology that I'm inviting us into today. It is a willful method that allows you to queer time and space, to disrupt, disturb, and bend time and space, to be open to alternative possibilities of collective existence, to being vulnerable and being transformed by people who are willfully resisting, disrupting, disturbing heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist, capitalist ways of knowing and ways of being. Octavia Butler disrupts white supremacist patriarchal narrative conventions through her literary form of speculative fiction. Elizabeth Chin's laboratory of speculative ethnology experiments with performance as a form of data gathering in the process of journeying through race as a geographical space of inquiry. Along with the decolonizing poetic forms of Layli Long Soldier and Teresa Hak Kyung Cha, Octavia Butler carves a pathway for us to follow a discursive practice that allows us to bend time, inhabit histories, her stories, their stories, witness present moments, and journey with people in unlikely juxtapositions of lived realities that appear as disparate, but are in fact ecologically connected with one another. From monthly queer soup nights in Brooklyn to equity at the table, an expansive database for food professionals promoting diversity, to pop-up cafes like Queer Anga's Aura Wise, to nonprofit organizations like Dream Cafe and Community Food Hub, to private monthly supper clubs that host cocktail parties, seated plated meals and community picnics, to stand-up comedy performances. Queer communities are creating culinary cultures of renewal and resurgence through emergent practices of food consciousness that arise with radical formations of culinary citizenship. Now being constantly redefined by the limits of national borders, racialized boundaries, and heteronormative patriarchal constructs of singular notions of belonging to family and nation, queer communities are breaking open the constraints of citizenship to celebrate the multiple ways of being and belonging. This is a conscientiously capacious attitude towards the practice of citizenship. Meredith Abarca and Pascual Soler define food consciousness as a, quote, pragmatic embodied epistemology wherein knowledge is acquired through the sensations and emotions that food awakens in the body, end quote. So I invite us to enter into a speculative space of performance by taking a seat with audience members who are experiencing the stand-up comedy performance of Delo. Natalie Bowie, writing for the May 2018 issue of The Slant, an Asian American media outlet, introduces Delo in an interview with him. She writes, Delo does not fit in a box. He wants you to know that right away. His queer, trans, and Tamil Sri Lankan identity is at the forefront of his work, always. And there's very little that he doesn't do. A co-producer for Disoriented Comedy, a mostly female Asian American stand-up comedy showcase. Delo features in Amazon's series Transparent, and also tours and facilitates workshops across the college circuit with his show De Facto Life. You are now in the method. I invite you to direct your attention to your bodies, our bodies, as we enter into the speculative space, the space of embodied listening, watching, witnessing. Allow ourselves a moment to listen to and with our breath, settling into our bodies in this moment. As you listen, watch, and witness, please take notes of where you are feeling words, phrases, and parts of this story landing in your body.
So the last time I came out, I had to come out and tell my mother that I had a girlfriend and that I had top surgery, right? So I'm like, oh great, this is the end of it all. Like we wasn't even talking that much. I was like, okay, whatever. I have to do this. I have to live my truth. So I came into her house and I was like, I'm gonna have to tell you 2 really fucking important things, and you're not gonna like it. In fact, you're gonna get crazy, and you're just gonna get crazy. And she's like, then don't tell me. It's like, I have to get this off my chest. Okay. I had to, okay? So then I'm like, I'm gonna listen. I have to tell you this thing. And she was cooking tofu, so she's like, I already know. And I'm like, what do you know, Amma? She said, I know that you have a girlfriend. I was like, yeah, I do. You okay with that? Okay. I was like, this next thing, this is really crazy. I already know. I'm like, you don't know this one, Amma, trust me. No, I know you're planning on having a surgery. Kind of, Amma, I actually already had the surgery. You already had the surgery? Who was with you? I was like, Nushi and Thambi were with me, and are you okay? Amma, are you okay? Don't take the injections, it's not safe. Amma, it's safe for the most part, but we could talk about that later. Like, are you okay? Are you sure it's safe? Yeah, Amma, for the most part, but like, are you okay? Okay. But then I got scared. Like, this is a calm before the storm, and pretty soon there's gonna be tofu flying all over the fucking kitchen. So I was like, I came around to her and I said, Amma, listen, are you sure you're okay, Amma? And she was like, I need ginger. I was like, okay, let's go to the Trader Joe, and plus you're running low on your hot cocoa, let's go. So we run over to the Trader Joe, I'm tripping out. I came out, I was like, what the fuck is happening? Nothing's happening. Oh, that's weird. Then we get to the Trader Joe, we get the ginger, but we can't find the fucking hot cocoa. So I said, I'm gonna go up to the clerk guy, go ask him where the hot cocoa is. The clerk, Trader Joe, go ask him where the hot cocoa is. And so meanwhile, I'm looking for the hot cocoa. I find it on the far wall on the very bottom shelf, and I get it, and I'm walking through and I'm looking up and down the aisles to see where my Amma is, and I can't find her, and I'm like, fuck, she's crumpled up in the corner crying or some shit. But then I find her, she's near the hot cocoa, and she's with Trader Joe. And I went up to her and I said, Amma, look, I already got you your hot cocoa, see? And she looks up at Trader Joe, and she looks up at me, and she looks at Trader Joe, and she said, oh, don't worry, he already got it for me. And then I was like, Amma, you just called me he, and I gave her the biggest motherfucking hug ever. I had stopped giving her hugs because I didn't want her to know, you know what I'm saying? I gave her the biggest hug, and I was like, you just called me he. And she said, you're confusing me.
I need ginger. The last time I came out, I already know. I had to tell my mother, I need ginger. You're running low on hot cocoa. I already know. I had a girlfriend. I need ginger. It's going to make you crazy. Then don't tell me. I have to live my truth. I need ginger. Is this the calm before the storm? Don't take the injections. Pretty soon, tofu flying all over the fucking place. It's not safe. And I had top surgery. I need ginger. Amma, I got you. Don't worry. He already got it for me. Your hot cocoa. I need ginger. Ginger and hot cocoa nourishes and sustains us together in solidarity with Delo and his, their, Amma. Ginger and hot cocoa bring us into being a part of what Elspeth Probyn calls an elementary assemblages, a way of being and knowing that, quote, enables us to observe how different bodies merge and in this way produce alternative forms of existence, end quote. We know the following about ginger and cocoa, that is confirmed by studies of nutrition and wellness by Johns Hopkins University. It's not just delicious, they say. Gingerol, a natural component of ginger root, benefits gastrointestinal motility, the rate at which food exits the stomach and continues along the digestive process. Eating ginger encourages efficient digestion, so food doesn't linger as long in the gut. Cocoa powder is rich in theobromine, which helps to reduce inflammation and can protect you from diseases such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Flavonols, a type of flavonoid found in dark chocolate, help to protect you from heart disease by lowering blood pressure, improving blood flow, and preventing cell damage. Delo's performance queers both the spaces of cooking and domesticity, while displacing narrative time through their telling of their coming out story. Through the stand-up comedy performance of coming out as queer, transgender, transnational, Tamil community member, Delo shares with us the capacity of ginger and cocoa to give form and content to recipes of queerness, which in turn allow us to witness the multiplicity of intersectional identities and relationships that give way to a mode of knowing and being in the world that disturbs and dismantles the colonizing structures of heteronormative white supremacist patriarchy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yamuna, for that wonderful insight into queering food, queering spaces, and queering our time as well. And I would like to now call Shuchi to begin with her opening remarks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's morning here. So good morning to all of you and good evening if you're in India on my side of home world. First, thank you so much. And thanks, Neil, for pushing me, actually, literally. He found me on Instagram because I was trying to chicken out of the panel discussion because it made me very nervous, because once I agreed, I realized that there is nothing scholarly or on record in context of Bangladesh in relation to queerness and food. So, you know, even though I was very intrigued by it, I wanted to do something about it. I felt like, I still feel like, I think Parama's cat, like, I don't know what to do. Oh, I'm that mode. So this, I know, I love that cat. I'm a cat mom myself. So you can see that I'm really a kind of, I'm not kind, I'm completely nervous because I don't have anything like scholarly to present. What I have though, which I think is at the beginning of a journey that might be coming my way, is looking back on my, decade-long research on Bangladesh LGBT movement, and especially heteronormativity. And through my PhD narratives, I want to go back and see where did I have the food connection, because the culture is very food-centric. The whole idea, Bengali idea of love, nurturing, care and kinship is all about food. Whether you have a lot of resources to offer high quality, high-end, expensive food item, or just one bhaji and bharta and something very, very mundane, but it is not in the item value of the food, but how you are approaching it and presenting it and organizing your kinship and claim of spaces and performances and roles that define who we are loving, how we are loving, and what we want to achieve through that journey of culinary experiences shared with a loved one. So bear with me, I'm going to be like moving from one direction to the other, because it is more like not a gossip conversation, because I did actually engage with my queer community friends before coming to the panel. I said, look, this is the topic, throw in ideas if you have any thoughts. So I will be including some of that. So it is very, very random, but very genuine in terms of how I connect this idea of gender, sexuality, and what food does for a community of people, or even like, any kind of gendered identity of people who are not socially allowed to claim spaces or express love in a way that is, not restricted or can fall under the category of non-normative. I just want to, clear the whole definition part here, that what is my working definition of queer. We can go in the Western English, translation of it as much as we want, but the truth is that in the Bangladesh context, we don't speak much English. We don't use English as our, a medium of expression, especially when it comes to sexuality. And queer is a term that is used strictly academically or for activists nowadays. So there is no easy way of asking someone that, what do you think queer food or queer food culture is? So if we take some of the breakdown of what the definition is, the peculiar, the sideways, the disruptive, it all can mean individually for each practices and performances that, and each queer person wants to put in action. So just to say that it is very, very open, fluid, non-English translation of the concept itself. So when I started collecting life stories for my PhD thesis, I spent years being with the LGBT movement in Bangladesh. And if you're familiar with that, you know that it started around formally kind of coming together around 2005-06 with coalitions and different academic activists trying to create an alliances and create a space. And it kind of collided with a very progressive world politics of, Obama era and how inclusive and all of that. So it was a time when you could see a lot of visibility of queer people, often elitist, urban, not really a grassroots movement, but it was coming together. So I started my own journey of, being an ally with the movement from early 2000, and it continues. It didn't end in between very well, because we have, murders and loss of friends, and they all featured in this reflexive journey of queer food culture. So I was thinking that, what if I look back, where is that food element? And I was very surprised to find actually a lot of events where food was central to my encounter or my interaction with my participants. So the first one is that I was visiting for some other work. I was visiting a brothel. In Bangladesh, we have many established brothels. These are mainly port areas. So one such low income group frequented brothel, I came across a lesbian couple. They wouldn't use the word lesbian. I'm just using it for clarity. Two women who are in love and who were fearing that they will be actually thrown out of the brothel because of the non-heteronormative practices, even though male non-heteronormative practices were welcomed and tolerated and, was not cared about. But women were very, very careful about how they expressed their sexual orientation, even when they were practicing, as part of their profession, heterosexual sexual practices. So I asked this woman, and she said, "Oh my God, I'm in love with this woman, and she's my life. She's this and that, and we're like married couples." So it intrigued me. I said, because you're using the word marriage, and I said, "What do you mean by married couple? What is marriage for you?" And she said, marriage is being in love. And I said, "And how do you express love?" And I said, "Is it sexual?" And she said, no, don't mix sex with love. Sex can happen, but that is not the main element. And I said, "Can you give me an example of what married couple love looks like?" And she said something very remarkable. She said, "Ami oke khaiye di, o amake khaiye dai," meaning that I feed her to the mouth and she feeds me, which is actually the most intimate expression of love and care. Because you not only share whatever little resource you have, because it is a hard work to find food when you are, at that kind of economic level, but also to share and to physically feed someone is an expression of physical intimacy, but also of a connection of spirituality, and that commitment that I connect with you is through that basic nourishment of food. And then she said that the other two were to cuddle and to share blouse and petticoat, which is also resource because you don't have much to share. So these are the intimate space and resource sharing where food comes as the primary resource that one uses to express the ultimate commitment and love for each other, even when it is non-normative. So I remember that, and it's like, how true is it for us when we want to show love and some kind of physical intimacy in the most normative manner, which is accepted by the whole society, but I know the subtext of what I'm practicing. So it creates this wonderful subtext between two people, that what food means and offering and feeding each other means. And that gave me one of the first things that, yes, that's true. Most people, I interviewed around 50, right, informants or participants, and it was divided. And these were bisexual men and women, gay men and lesbian women, and single women who are over the age of 30. So we are all non-heteronormative practitioners. So that was the main group. Interestingly, for gay men who had, because of their male position in the society at the time, had more resources, access to resources and access to spaces, chose to meet me always in cafes, which is a great thing. Because why? Because there are certain spaces that are not claimed, like in bold letters, as queer, but queer friendly. I'm talking about 2007-8, around that time, which is very different now. And owners that and it is always around something that is comforting. The cafe culture was just starting, so it created this idea of, I'm not being regular, I'm also going for or aspiring to be very modern, and whatever we're ordering, like a cinnamon or a carrot cake, these were very new at the time. They might sound silly in today's time, but that time it was something very new. But at the same time, you have the desi ones like dahi fuchka and chatpati and stuff. But it all created a kind of a replica of what we would have as adda, the informal get together of friends that usually happens in a tea stall or at home. But because of the combination of people and the topic that we were going to talk about, which is life history of sexuality, we needed to nurture ourselves not only in a space that was queer friendly, but also that gave us all these intersections of modernity, tradition, because we were transgressing, all these spaces in our conversations, which, and men could not, because most men were also performing heteronormative, heterosexual roles in their personal lives. So going to their personal spaces at home was more difficult. On the other hand, women, informants who were bisexual women or lesbian women, were extremely closeted, obviously. I don't like the word closet because I think it's so like, we used to use alnas. Closet is a new thing for us as furniture. We don't hide things. We don't even hide underwears. So there's nothing to hide, but not to disclose. Let's say, I think it's a strategic willingness of non-disclosure, which is closet for me. But women preferred to meet me in their personal spaces because homosociality was very, useful. So to have an external, an outsider friend, new friend, to come in home where you can pretend to invite a friend for lunch. And again, it is food-centered because that's what you do. That's how you welcome new people. So this whole division of spaces and the women wanted to cook for you and show what it means to cook and care. And for women to actually invite me in their personal spaces and offer food through cooking as an act itself is a symbol of acceptance, because it was very difficult to ice break with women than with men. There was a gender and sexuality kind of a tension between me and lesbian women, and we can talk about that. And there's a class difference at times. So there were a lot of barriers. But when women decided that they had built a trust and would be willing to be part of a research that was the first of its kind, it was through these symbol of nurture and food and cooking and saying that I care for you and I trust you, therefore you come in the space. There was a very, I think, well-made and very useful, if you have not watched it, I'm sure you have, Amra Ki Etoi Bhinno, Are We That Different?, which was a documentary on hijra and bisexual and gay men in Bangladesh in 2012, so 10 years ago. And in one of those narratives, you find a young man from a rural context with very little money, narrating how he fell in love with someone who came from a little more affluent background, but had a kind of a camaraderie, love, flirty relationship. And he wanted to invite his love interest to his space. And he said that I went out of my way to find, dish items that I could cook and make an elaborate lunch, a spread, which is like a lot of money and effort to cook chicken and mutton and this and that. So this is beyond his means. And he didn't come. And in that moment, he looked so sad. He said, but I made all these efforts. It was so difficult for me, but I cooked and I arranged this lunch and he didn't come and he rejected me. So when you offer something that is, again, representative of what you are willing to give up, to share in terms of food, which is so basic. Bangladesh is, agrarian society. People are not always rich. So when you're willing to part with whatever little you have, it shows your commitment and your eagerness to that person in this very, very troubled, grounds of relationship and sexuality and identities. So these were the things I thought about. So I asked my friends that, how do you, we had a conversation because Bangladesh is having, it is Ramadan time. So many friends are meeting up, especially queer friends are meeting up for their own iftar events. And so they're discussing this. But talking about creating space and iftar is also very significant in Bangladesh queer community culture. One of our friends, an activist, Zulhaz, who was killed 5 years ago, actually around this time, one of his way of doing activism and create a community, and especially youth community, to bring young people under the umbrella of this, that you have human rights, to initiate people into the rights movement, was to host an iftar event every year at his maternal home. He shared his space in a building that belonged to his grandmother and mother, and every year there was this open door event of iftar where anybody could walk in. His home was always part of his own activism of offering space and food to anyone who needed space and food. But this was something that he wanted to make as a kind of, very out on the face, that I'm doing it, I'm queer, I'm doing it, this is a space, you can come in irrespective of who you are. So that was one of the earliest, food-centric queer space that tried to claim rights of coexistence with respectability. But it required resources. He dedicated most of his money and earnings in doing this kind of activism, always, creating spaces. It also later on, gave encouragement to other young activists who, in different duration of time, opened their own queer spaces under the guise of cafes. Currently, there are a couple of street-styled cafes that belong to queer joints. Not necessarily, if you know it's queer, then it's queer. If it's not, then it's not. These are fluid, but these are things. But I must say that queer spaces are what we can say that, because it is so gendered, cooking, food, if you think of food, and the question is, are we what we eat? And I think for Bangladeshi context, or a very, transition between traditional and modernity and always fighting with each other kind of a tension, that kind of context, we are not what we eat. We are who we feed. It is not the food item is not, it is gendered. The achars, the pickles, the tamarinds, the green popsicles, to the smaller pieces of any protein, the leftovers are feminine. Anything grand, anything of higher nutrition value, uncomplicated, big piece of drumstick is masculine consumption, right? Food preparation itself is highly gendered, except for bawarchis and chefs who are professional. But what has happened, especially in social media time, you will see that queer men have started claiming some of this, what is stereotypically the feminine domain of cooking and food preparation and presentation. And one friend actually gave me a very interesting insight, said, it is an opportunity to find a bond with the only ally a gay man will find in family, which is mom. So this is where you find your connection with your mom, because, there is something that is beyond this, mother, son, the performances of masculinity. But this is where that intimate space of kitchen that mom will open up, because there is so much of love for a child. But so the food is not queer. The approach is, and I asked, what is queer approach to food? And the fantastic ones came, and I'll give you some of the glimpses. Friends say it's a bit extra, over the top, but high on aesthetics. And presentation, the food presentation is very, very important for the queer groups, because it is not what you're preparing only, it is how you are presenting. So if you have access to a more safe space, it can range from very aesthetic, beautiful to erotic, but at the same time, it is never shabby. It's not just thrown in. It is that effort. The effort shows. But again, what it does in the end of the day is to create a kinship, a community that you are sure to exist, but you have very little visibility of claiming that only, not only within the queer community, but how you make allies. It is through food preparation, sharing, the aesthetics, the presentations, and the subtle subtext that you send through this unspoken language of care and nourishment, and saying that I'm willing to share my table and whatever I have, and I will probably feed you with hand, because this is how I connect with each other. And that's where the importance of food-centric space claim politics, I think, stands today. I cannot give you evidences. I cannot give you anything that will stand as a research one, but I think it's a fascinating space I would like to investigate in future. But I will end it with something. I think that, we might have different sexual orientations that claim. I claim as a heterosexual woman with a very queer mind. And I was thinking, if I'm doing to sideline or being obstructive, how do I approach food when it comes to love, romance, or sexuality? If I'm trying to send, this idea of intimate care for someone, I do not cook elaborate meals of risalas and biryanis because I don't know how to cook them, but they're just too much marriage oriented. I cook something that is so everyday, but done so well, because it is with that refinement of something ordinary that I try to present to someone, that I want to show that, it matters, because I am caring for the most ordinary in the most extraordinary way. And that is, in a way, very erotic. It's very romantic. And we all find different subversive ways of approaching body, sexuality, and intimacy. And food definitely is one of that. Pan, used to be one of the most erotic food items, not anymore, but probably will come back in one way or the other. It's totally random. Thank you so much. But, these are random thoughts. I hope, I contributed some way, but I'm not sure of that. I still feel like Parama's cat.
Thank you so much, Shuchi. I think this has given us a lip-smacking insight into Bangladeshi cultures, food cultures, cuisine, intimacies, and acts of care. And I mean, I think I just have probably one question, which features in both of your initial remarks. And I think the act of cooking itself is often equated as an act of care, especially in South Asian households, of course. And there it carries with it this gendered practice of passing on, cooking, passing on the recipes from one generation to another, often, with that sort of responsibility lying on one gender more than the other. So I'm just wondering, and if you could give your insights, both of you, on how we can derive queer pleasure in cooking, and in ways that does not centralize reproducing a culinary subject in the next generation, but can we think of radical ways in the act of cooking itself that could give us queer pleasure? And I see both of you touch it in your initial remarks as well, but maybe few more thoughts for our audiences. And either of you can please go first.
I just spoken. Yamuna, you can go first. And you have such a beautiful voice, please.
Shuchi, I loved your sharing and your analysis. I guess Shreyashi, to answer your question, one way that queer communities are already doing this is by and I think this is shared in Shuchi, your conversations with Bangladeshi queer communities as well. So I'm speaking from a transnational context. And that is where our kitchens, our spaces of making food become this transnational space. That's part of that practice of decolonizing our identities that are attached to a singular nation or a singular identity, be it through nation, through sexuality, through gender. And so disturbing those norms as a part of a community, a communal experience where domestic spaces are then transformed into politicized radical spaces or radicalizing spaces, politically radicalizing spaces. So the community, rather than a domestic kitchen that is demarcated by gender and sex or sexuality as feminine, the domestic kitchen is feminine, that queer communities and alimentary assemblages are redefining that space as a radical, politically engaged space where there isn't a singular identity that is demanded to be subjugated. So whether it's in the practice of cooking, whether it's in the practice of gathering food, and whether and how we use food as poetically and deploy it as a metaphor to make sense of our world. So in my analysis of that coming out story by Delot and her taking her mom shopping for ginger, and ginger becomes that portal through which ginger and cocoa become that portal through which healing, negotiation of identity, a transformation, and acceptance and acknowledgement, all of these are nourished through that space where that domestic space of the kitchen where she invited us into at first, where her mom is making tofu, all of that is then split apart. It's and ruptured. And that's part of what a queering practice is. That would be my first point of entry to your question.
Thank you, Yamuna. Shuchi, if you'd like to add.
Queering the kitchen space, also this is such a contextual thing. I mean, to have separate kitchen is such an urban modern concept in my part of the world that, I think I'm probably the first generation that has grown up having small kitchen because, this apartment style living urban arrangements were coming into being in the early 80s. Before that, you already had an open kitchen. So how do you create personal space in a setup that is too open and people can see who is getting in and out? So it's a very, very recent phenomena where, we can create a private space for kitchen where mothers and sisters and, household helps would occupy. But the entry of the queer, and I'm talking about here men, because this is because the space is feminine anyway, so anybody belonging to femininity will not struggle to occupy that space. It's the masculine entry to the feminine space of kitchen and food preparation is what creates the kind of disruption. And as I was saying, that it is a opportunity of bonding or creating little space for yourself. But a queer friend in a discussion an informant say that, this is something remarkable that people do not notice. It is through the queer boys and men who had started creating little bit of entry point to the kitchen, has actually made it possible in today's time for every man to experiment or to even feel comfortable with cooking something. So it is not as much as a taboo, especially in the urban Bangladeshi context, for men to kind of glorify themselves with 2 dishes that they've learned in their lifetime. But nevertheless, that the space is not as gendered. It is not so neutral anymore yet, but the fluidity of masculinity and femininity going in and out of a typically feminine space is possible, mainly because there has been a queer claim to that space, for a while now. And when we were young, and if you see children playing, not like video games kind of children, but children who go out and play, you're very toddlers, there is a very common thing that we do is rannabati to replicate domestic setup. So one becomes a mother, one becomes the dad, one becomes a child, and you cook, make believe food, and you feed each other. So you become a household. It is always, if there's a boy who is part of that, will be the father, and he will be fed. Even if he fights to death to be the cook, we will not allow. You stay here, you sit, we will all make something, and we will feed you. So it keeps on happening, and that is something keeps on reproducing these spaces and gendered way of looking into food and preparation. But it takes all the more effort for say a queer young person to break away those barriers and claim a space of bonding with mothers or sisters, the only allies that will be possible. It's almost like that scene about or ginger and hot cocoa, or these are such small moments in outer world's eyes, but so meaningful, in that moment between the child and the parent, that it either makes or breaks your sanity at times. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. Just understanding the space of kitchen as a radical space because of the queer experiences and the queer possibilities that are created. And I think I would like to now move on from this, because just something that flows from this is a question from the audience, and we've received a lot of questions. But I think both of you touch upon also this idea of mundaneness or routine in navigating food in the kitchen, in the queering practices that occur in the kitchen. And somehow this ritualized practice, do you think it results in a certain ritualization of queer spaces, and perhaps it helps in despectacularizing queerness in general, in the general eye, because as a routine, as a repetition, is no longer becomes a spectacle that sort of haunts us or that sort of stands out, but it also becomes part of our of the mundaneness that we navigate in our everyday life.
Should I?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think I have not actually come across a moment in the Bangladesh context where it has become mundane. Maybe when people learn to or decide to live together as queer couple, that becomes a mundane anything. I think anything that is within this framework of marriage style living together becomes mundane and becomes routinized. There's nothing spectacular. But for the time being that I know now, for so far, the performance of food and food culture and presentation is based on spectacle, mainly because it tries to make a statement out of it. Right. And you'd be not surprised, but since I think early 2000, the events, the spaces of such hosting is claimed by white expats in Dhaka because they have the most access to security and money and, good wine and good food, and people will not mess up with their space. So it is, it's an interesting space. You can racialize it, it's very elite and all of that. And once that becomes a kind of standard or a reference point, the localized versions start making their own variations of those spectacular arrangements of kinship and hosting. And so hosting is very important. It is still not mundane when it comes to more of a community-based event or some, the kind of dawat, styled social networking opportunities. It is still, that's what I know so far. I'm sure it has so much of variety depending on class. And I must tell you that most of the scholarship and work that we do in Bangladesh, it's very little on sexuality in general. It's either on urban sexuality, or which is very, very middle and upper class, or it is about transgender, which again has a different class implication, and women remain invisible anyway from the conversations all the time. So it is very difficult to give a very generalized conclusion about what is mundane, what is repetitive, because it hasn't reached the level of acceptance, visibility in the society that it can afford to be repetitive and mundane yet. It is still in a struggle to make itself just exist, so.
Thank you, Shuchi. Yamuna.
So I guess again my point of entry would be if we understand if we can juxtapose spectacle and the mundane, and if we are situating ourselves within LGBTQ radicalizing spaces, so that scene, or the scene of coming out, the scene of sharing intimacies, the scenes of confronting heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist norms. So it's meaningful as to what we identify as the mundane and what we identify as spectacle. So do we identify heteronormativity as spectacle, or do we collapse into it as, well, that's normal? Do we identify queer pleasure as a spectacle, or do we identify it as mundane? And then how does food become a vehicle through which we transport ourselves back and forth between the spectacle and the mundane? So it's really meaningful that food practices, food preparations, elements of food practices or ingredients become really meaningful signifiers that move between the mundane and into the spectacular. So that ginger becomes the vehicle to say, I need to get out of the kitchen. I need to stay in the kitchen. I need to embrace you, and I need to disturb you. Is that a mundane? You're going to freak out? I already know. Who was with you? Are those mundane moments? Are those spectacular moments? Are they spectacular in our imaginary? And how do we then shape a sense of belonging and not belonging? That push and pull. So culinary citizenships then invite us into thinking really radically about our need to belong, our willingness to disrupt, to disturb, and to nourish each other through food practices, but then how those nourishing, sustaining practices might necessarily need to travel back and forth between the mundane and the spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yamuna. And unfortunately, we're out of time, so we might not be able to take any more questions. But of course, this is a conversation that is just an appetizer to the food cultures across South Asian households, across kitchen spaces. And I think it has been so wonderful speaking to both of you. Thank you so much. I will now call Neil to just close the conference for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sreshi.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such a rich presentation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today for rather a long time. And it's so nice to see you all. This today concludes the first day of Delicious Desires, Queer Foodways in South Asia. We come again tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. IST. We have yet another appetizing set of ideas and practices with a wonderful roster of scholars and practitioners across disciplines and interests. So we look forward to having you again tomorrow. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much, Shreyashi. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Neil, can I ask a question? Will the questions on the Q&A be saved? I was wondering.
I'm not sure.
I think we're recording it, so that should happen.
Okay, because I'm asking because, with uncanny timing, my, sorry, I'm sorry, I haven't slept last night, so I'm also missing words, so, my keyboard is not working, I changed